中美双方并没有就关税问题进行磋商或谈判，美方不要混淆视听。
U.S. trade restrictions continuing to make an impact on semiconductor companies such as NVIDIA.
NVIDIA's CFO warning that China sales will drop significantly in the fourth quarter.
The Biden administration is trying to cap China's access to advanced.
Your next smartphone might be even more expensive if the US-China chip war escalates.
Beijing secretly removed tariffs on US tech without telling anyone. For months, China told the world it could endure any pressure.
如果美方置两国和国际社会的利益于不顾，执意打关税战、贸易战，中方必将奉陪到底。
But when US semiconductors slipped through customs, tariff-free, it wasn't strength. It was survival. When 8 categories of US semiconductors suddenly passed through Chinese customs, it wasn't a mistake. And this wasn't just about chips. Behind the scenes, exemptions extended to aircraft parts, critical pharmaceuticals, and more. Lifelines for industries China can't sustain alone. So while the headlines focused on political bravado, the real story was unfolding in silence. Today, we uncover what Beijing doesn't want you to know. Let's get into it. While headlines focused on political statements, something far more important was happening in China's ports. Import agencies in Shenzhen noticed that 8 categories of US semiconductors were no longer subject to the 125% retaliatory tariffs. There was no public notice, no official decree. Businesses only discovered this change when their customs paperwork came back, showing a 0 tariff rate where heavy duties once applied. By quietly lifting tariffs, Beijing avoided public scrutiny while ensuring that its tech industry, heavily reliant on US chips, could continue to function. This was damage control, hidden behind a facade of strength. And semiconductors were just the beginning. Reports confirmed similar exemptions for aircraft components, including engines and landing gear, as well as critical pharmaceuticals. These were not random choices. They were lifelines for industries that China cannot sustain alone. This silent rollback didn't happen in isolation. It's part of a much larger story, one that began months ago when President Trump reignited trade tensions under the banner of reciprocal fairness. What started as a 34% tariff quickly spiraled into a full-blown economic confrontation, with Washington raising duties to a staggering 145% on Chinese goods. Beijing responded predictably, matching tariffs with its own 125% levy on all US imports. On the surface, it appeared to be a balanced exchange. 2 global powers, each refusing to blink. But beneath this tit-for-tat escalation, both sides were making quiet calculations. The US moved early to shield its tech giants by exempting smartphones, laptops, and key electronic components. China, meanwhile, encouraged domestic consumption campaigns, urging citizens to buy local products in a show of patriotic resilience. Yet as the months passed, it became clear that slogans and tariffs couldn't mask structural dependencies, especially when it came to advanced technology and critical imports. The recent silent exemptions are just the latest chapter in a trade war where appearances matter as much as outcomes. For years, China has championed the idea of technological self-sufficiency. Massive investments were poured into domestic semiconductor development with ambitions to rival the US, Taiwan, and South Korea. But ambition doesn't erase dependency overnight. Despite its efforts, China still imported nearly $12 billion in semiconductors from the US last year. These weren't luxury goods. They were essential components for everything from smartphones to military hardware. Particularly vulnerable were logic chips, an area dominated by American firms like Intel and Texas Instruments. Without these chips, China's tech sector would stall, impacting not only consumer electronics but also critical infrastructure. The aviation sector tells a similar story. The C919, China's flagship passenger jet, relies on engines produced by a US-French joint venture. Applying tariffs to such imports would cripple domestic aerospace ambitions. Pharmaceuticals present another challenge. Certain life-saving drugs and chemical precursors are sourced primarily from US facilities. When Beijing surveyed foreign companies, many warned that continued tariffs would disrupt supply chains beyond repair. But how long can China pretend to fight a war it's already retreating from? And what happens when these lifelines run out? In short, Beijing's retaliation had clear limits. set not by political will, but by economic necessity. While China was forced into silent concessions, Washington's approach was far more deliberate and visible. Trump's tariff strategy wasn't about total economic warfare. It was about identifying pressure points and exploiting them. By exempting smartphones, laptops, and other consumer electronics from US tariffs, Trump protected American companies like Apple and Microsoft, maintaining domestic stability while keeping leverage over China, where it mattered most. In sectors like semiconductors, Trump refused to budge. This forced Beijing into a difficult position: either maintain its public stance and suffocate key industries, or quietly adjust to avoid deeper damage. Trump's recent comments that tariffs could come down substantially weren't gestures of goodwill. They were signals that the US holds the upper hand. The message to Xi Jinping was clear: negotiate from a position of weakness, or watch the pressure mount. Meanwhile, Beijing continued to insist there were no trade talks, even as internal policies reflected a different reality. This wasn't just a trade dispute, it was a demonstration of how economic tools could be weaponized with precision. While much of the world's attention remains fixed on the US-China standoff, the ripple effects of Trump's tariff strategy are being felt far beyond Beijing. In Tokyo, Brussels, and Seoul, policymakers are watching closely, aware that today's pressure on China could become tomorrow's bargaining chip against other trading partners. Japan, for instance, has found itself navigating a delicate path. Trump recently hinted at being very close to a bilateral deal with Tokyo, framing it as a model for future agreements. Analysts view this as a test case, an opportunity for Washington to showcase how hardline tactics can extract favorable terms without prolonged conflict. Meanwhile, Europe faces its own uncertainties. With China courting EU support against what it calls America's unilateral bullying, Brussels is being drawn into a geopolitical balancing act, caught between safeguarding trade interests with both Washington and Beijing. Even Taiwan and South Korea, key players in the global semiconductor supply chain, are feeling the pressure. As the US tightens control over advanced chip exports, these nations risk being entangled in a broader tech war, where neutrality is no longer an option. Trump's strategy, while aimed at Beijing, is reshaping global trade dynamics, forcing allies and competitors alike to reassess their positions in a world where economic leverage is increasingly weaponized. What began with semiconductors and aircraft parts is now expanding. Reports indicate that China is reviewing a list of over 131 product categories, representing approximately $45 billion in imports, for potential tariff exemptions. This list includes everything from industrial chemicals to advanced machinery and medical supplies. Each exemption is a quiet acknowledgment of sectors where China remains vulnerable. Yet Beijing refuses to publicly admit these retreats. The government continues to project resilience, framing the trade war as a long-term struggle where China can endure more pain than Washington. But endurance has limits. With rising unemployment, deflationary trends, and a backlog of unsold exports, China's economic challenges are growing. The more exemptions Beijing grants, the clearer it becomes that this is not a sustainable fight. It's a series of calculated withdrawals masked by political rhetoric. As silent exemptions continue to surface, one question dominates the minds of economists and strategists alike. Where does this end? If Beijing continues its strategy, public defiance, private concessions, we're looking at a prolonged stalemate. Tariffs stay on paper, industries survive through silent exemptions, both sides claim victory while quietly avoiding collapse. If no decisive move is made, global markets risk years of uncertainty, trapped in a battle for technological dominance. This is no longer about tariffs. It's about who controls technology and global influence. Publicly, China stands firm. Privately, it's making quiet concessions to keep its economy afloat. Trump's strategy of targeted pressure has exposed the gap between Beijing's ambitions and its current capabilities. This isn't about who shouts louder in press conferences. It's about who adapts behind the scenes. So, while the world debates whether the US or China is winning the trade war, the real story lies in these silent policy shifts, where survival outweighs pride. The question now is simple. How many more exemptions will Beijing issue before it can no longer claim defiance? And will Washington continue to press its advantage or risk pushing global markets into deeper uncertainty? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more insights into global trade dynamics and geopolitical strategies.